I have referenced several times that most children do not grow up in a monolingual society, that they grew up in at least a multilingual society. And in many cases, a multilingual household where at least two, maybe more languages are spoken. And that's not even counting the different dialects. So I thought it would be important to have a section talking about this. When we talk about bilingualism in children, we're talking about what is considered to be native or quasi-native bilingualism, meaning from birth, that would be native, or soon after, like a couple, 3 years in. Some of you are native bilinguals. You grew up in households where more than one language was spoken, and or in your society, more than one language was spoken. Many of you are quasi-native, meaning you spoke one language in the house to a certain point. Preschool or kindergarten is usually the start of when things change, and then you have to speak a different language. So let's talk about that process a little bit. Historically, and by that I mean in the last 40 years, there have been two main hypotheses with respect to childhood bilingualism, meaning hypotheses on how the child is constructing these grammars in their head, in their mental lexicon. Unitary system and separate systems. These are two different hypotheses. Unitary system is that the child initially only constructs one lexicon and one grammar, and then has a word associated with a term from one language or another, but not necessarily both. And the evidence for that suggests that, for example, young children in particular will only have one term for a given item. So one referent for a given meaning. So if they are a Spanish-English bilingual, for example, and they see this thing, they're only going to either say bottle or botella. They're not going to say both. And there's some evidence for this. The other hypothesis is separate systems. So the child is not constructing only one lexicon and one grammar, but one for each language that they're trying to acquire, and that they make the connections along the way. There seems to be more support for separate systems, although at times it seems like unitary system might prevail, but most of the time it seems like separate systems hypothesis works the best. The real example of this has to do with children when they are producing and they mix their languages. So I'll use English and Spanish as the examples because of those are the two languages I'm most fluent in, and the two languages that you folks by and large understand, especially English, but many of you have some background in Spanish. So if you take a Spanish-English child, Spanish-English bilingual child, and you listen to them talk and they mix their languages, there's a system to it. They never use the incorrect syntax. They never try to use morphology from one language on lexicon from a different language. So you would hear a child say, I want to go to la playa. La playa in Spanish meaning the beach. They do not say, I want to go a la playa. They don't try to mix the morphology and syntax from Spanish and English. They will just use lexicon in the appropriate spaces. If they're talking about a brown dog, they will say the brown dog, but they will not say the dog brown. The order of the noun and the adjective in English is the opposite of what it is in Spanish. So the child won't try and mix the order of the noun phrase. They will stay in whatever structure is set up for the given language. And they do this early on. So whether it is unitary or separate, that we're still not sure of. We tend to lean more on separate systems hypothesis, but there is evidence for both. Speaking of all of that, code switching. So let's talk about code switching. I'm very aware that in most immigrant societies, code switching is considered evil. It's horrible. And certainly prescriptively, when a child or an adult comes into a formal education or formal setting, they're told they can't code switch. They have to say in one language or the other, but they cannot mix. Here's the reality. Code switching is the best thing that a language learner can do, whether we're talking about a child or an adult, but especially a child. Code switching shows the amount that the child has acquired in both languages. I'll give you a great example. We had a neighbor growing up that, while of course this is California, the parents spoke English, the parents were teaching their children Mandarin because they were Taiwanese, and the mother was also a teacher of Cantonese. So she was fluent in Cantonese as well as Mandarin. And so she was teaching the children Cantonese and predominantly Mandarin as their first language. English was going to come later, and they just accepted that. So their daughter, when she was 2, 3, 4 years old, would come toddling down the hill with her family and would come and visit and would start talking to us in her language. Now, I say it that way because it was a code switch of Mandarin and Cantonese with an occasional English word thrown in there for fun. Of course, my parents and I, we didn't understand the child because we speak neither Mandarin nor Cantonese. And so the mother in particular would have to translate. But it was so cute to see how she was putting things together, and how the mother in particular would have this question mark on her face when she could not put the pattern together initially. Children will subconsciously code switch. They're doing it as just part of spitting out their thoughts. There's no regard for audience. They haven't learned about, you don't speak a language in front of somebody that they don't understand. So they just blurt stuff out, and there's combinations, but those combinations tell us how much they have learned about their respective languages. Adults are different. Adults will consciously code switch, do it with intention, and they will only preferably do this with other bilinguals because they know the stigma of speaking a language that the other person you're talking to does not understand. It's really, really interesting to see how code switching develops in a bilingual child. Around the age of 8 is when they start understanding when and why to code switch. It can happen a little bit before, but mostly it's around the age of 8. And again, if you think about a child's development, it's about that time they're starting to learn social mores and norms. Politeness starts really factoring in around that time. So they're starting to put a lot of pieces together. The other piece to this is really important with respect to code switching, and that's consistent input in both languages. If a child has consistent input in both or all of the languages that they speak, they will continue to code switch and become more and more proficient at it. But if the input of one of the languages stops, the code switching also stops, and they start switching to become more monolingual. It can come back. Certainly if they go to learn their heritage language, then certainly that's part of it, but they will come back to this. But frequently that other language will die out if they stop receiving input from it. Again, this gets back to contextual knowledge, and this is where semantics and pragmatics come in, meaning a young child isn't going to have that knowledge because they haven't developed that mentality, or neurologically, they haven't either. But with respect to as they age, things improve. This has all led to the contextual knowledge hypothesis, which is really becoming more entrenched when we're talking about bilingualism, both in children and adults. And especially as a child reaches that age of about 8, when they start intentionally code switching one way or the other. And it explains a bit about how adults switch between languages because they're using the contextual knowledge, the environmental cues to know when they can switch. But it also explains how listeners go between languages. So if you are an English Spanish bilingual, if I say sí, depending on the context, depends on which language I'm using, depends on which meaning I'm attaching to that syllable, sí. If I'm speaking English, or if I'm referring to the ocean or the sea, then if I say sí, you're going to think of body of water. If I'm not, and especially if I'm speaking Spanish, then you're going to think of it as yes, because that is how you say yes in Spanish. It's also how you say if, but that's another story. So you're using the contextual clues to understand when you're going back and forth. And this is both passive and active. So both in receiving and listening language and when you're producing language. We use parsing to help us with this. We'll come back to parsing in neurolinguistics in the next chapter. But it's really important to understand that this is part of what a child acquires if they're in a multilingual environment. It's not just learning the actual lexicon and the morphology and the syntax and everything else. It also ties into the context clues.